Ever imagine a world before the pill? Like
Uh-huh.
way before, where the options to, plan your family were a little more rustic.
Oh, definitely.
Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the history of contraception, like way back in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Okay.
You might be surprised at what people used and just how long, people have been trying to um, control their fertility.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how people, even centuries ago, were looking for ways to kind of manage family size.
It is. It's like a fundamental human thing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We've got a historian's take on this period, plus an actual 17th century herbal guide to help us figure this all out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What were some of the methods people used, before modern medicine?
Well, before all the science that we rely on today, people relied on a mix of practices, kind of rooted in tradition, belief, and just observation.
Right?
Abstinence was common, often encouraged by social norms like later marriage ages, especially in rural communities.
That makes sense. Putting off marriage would definitely impact family size.
Exactly.
But abstinence wasn't always the solution, was it? Our historian mentioned some rather creative methods.
Indeed. While religious authorities really condemned practices like coitus interruptus,
Right.
it seems people were still, shall we say, taking matters into their own hands.
Well, human nature's timeless, I guess. What about other methods? Did people try anything that was actually effective?
So, breastfeeding was recognized as a natural contraceptive, particularly for working class women who breastfed for extended periods.
Interesting.
This kind of inadvertently gave them more control over their fertility compared to, say, aristocratic women who often relied on wet nurses.
So even back then, access to different methods was kind of influenced by social class.
Exactly.
Now, what about those herbal remedies? Our 17th century guide mentioned some pretty intriguing ingredients. Were any of those effective?
Well, the effectiveness of these herbal concoctions is debatable. Some aim to suppress libido, like lettuce was believed to have a cooling effect on passions.
Hold on. Lettuce. Like, honey, I'm having a salad for dinner tonight, if you know what I mean.
Haha, it sounds humorous to us now, but it really highlights the limited options people had and their reliance on, folklore and observation.
Right.
Other herbs were used with the intention of inducing menstruation, which could potentially lead to an early term abortion.
So, it sounds like these methods were a bit of a gamble, with varying degrees of effectiveness and potentially significant risks for women.
Absolutely.
But this all leads us to a pretty interesting development. The rise of condoms, and not the kind we're used to today.
Exactly. The syphilis outbreak in the mid-16th century really prompted the development of the earliest condoms fashioned from linen.
So initially more of a protective measure against disease than a contraceptive.
Precisely. However, comfort wasn't a top priority with these linen sheaths. Imagine wearing one, not exactly a recipe for a romantic evening.
I can imagine. So how did we transition from linen to, well, what did those early condoms look like?
This is where things get a little more, shall we say, surprising. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, condoms made from animal intestines, specifically sheep or pig intestines, had emerged.
Animal intestines. That's definitely not something you hear about every day.
It's true.
How were those even made?
It was a surprisingly labor-intensive process. Cleaning, treating, and drying animal intestines was no easy feat.
Yeah.
These condoms were expensive, and what's even more surprising is that they were often reused multiple times.
Reused. Okay, that's where I draw the line.
Huh.
Despite the material and, let's say, questionable hygiene practices, how effective were these condoms at preventing pregnancy?
You might be surprised to learn that they were about as effective as modern condoms.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable considering the circumstances. But I have to ask, what about, STIs? Did they offer any protection there?
Unfortunately, that's where those early condoms fell short. They provided little to no protection against STIs.
Effective for one purpose, not so much for the other. This makes me wonder, how did society view these attempts to control fertility, especially in a time of, strict moral codes?
It's important to remember that access to and control over these early contraceptives were largely determined by gender. Men held more power in this realm, while women faced harsher consequences for seeking to manage their own fertility.
A double standard, even back then. But the fact that condoms existed at all, even as primarily for men, does kind of suggest a shift in attitudes, right? Maybe a move away from viewing sex solely for procreation.
It's an interesting point. Did the separation of sex from procreation, even in a limited way, start to shift societal norms? It's difficult to say for certain. While the use of condoms and other methods suggests a move away from sex purely for procreation, it's likely that the impact wasn't widespread enough to cause a major societal shift in those times.
But it's possible that these practices planted the seeds for changes we see later, eventually leading to, like, the sexual revolution of the 1960s.
Exactly. The availability of condoms, even primarily for men, hints at a growing recognition of sexuality as something beyond just reproduction. It's a subtle shift in perspective that's important to acknowledge.
It's fascinating to see how these early practices, as rudimentary as they might seem now, foreshadowed the future of reproductive health. It's like a slow burn, a gradual shift in attitudes that eventually sparked a revolution.
Absolutely.
We'll have to delve deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how these early practices paved the way for future revolutions in reproductive health. Join us for part 2, where we'll uncover the social, cultural, and technological forces that shaped the landscape of contraception, leading up to the game changer that was the pill. Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of contraception.
We've uncovered some fascinating insights into the lengths people went to in the 16th and 17th centuries to manage their fertility.
From lettuce as a libido suppressant to condoms made from animal intestines, it's clear that the desire to control reproduction has a long and intriguing history.
It really does.
And we've seen how social attitudes, access, and even technological advancements have played a role in shaping the landscape of reproductive control.
Absolutely.
Speaking of those early condoms, we talked about linen sheaths last time.
Right.
That was the first iteration.
Actually, the first documented mention of a condom comes from Italian anatomist Gabriele Falloppio in the 16th century. He's better known for discovering the fallopian tubes.
Right.
But he also described a linen sheath designed to protect against syphilis.
Multi-talented guy.
Yeah, it seems so.
But those early fabric condoms, while groundbreaking, didn't exactly sound comfortable.
No.
How did they compare to the later animal gut condoms?
Well, imagine wearing a linen sheath. Comfort wasn't exactly a top priority.
Right. Yeah.
The move to animal intestines, while surprising to us today, was likely motivated by a desire for something more pliable and comfortable.
It's fascinating how necessity and practicality drove innovation, even in those times.
Yeah.
Speaking of those animal gut condoms, how did they actually work?
To make them flexible, you'd soak them in liquid before use, water, milk, whatever was handy. Think of it like rehydrating dried fruit.
Okay, that's both ingenious and a little unsettling.
Yeah.
Were these condoms used solely for pregnancy prevention?
Interestingly, no. They were used for both pregnancy and disease prevention.
Oh, interesting.
This suggests a growing awareness of the dual purpose these devices could serve.
That makes sense given the syphilis epidemic we talked about.
Right.
It also highlights that gender disparity we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Men had more control over contraception, while women faced greater risks and consequences.
Absolutely.
The sources we have primarily focus on men's experiences with condoms. Advertising was also clearly targeted toward them.
Yeah.
Women's options, like those herbal remedies, often carried moral judgment and even legal repercussions.
Unfortunately.
It's a stark reminder that while both men and women sought to control their fertility, access and societal acceptance were far from equal.
Definitely.
This leads to a crucial question. Did the availability of these early contraceptives, however limited, impact attitudes toward sex itself?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
Did the separation of sex from procreation, even in a limited way, start to shift societal norms? It's difficult to say for certain.
Right.
While the use of condoms and other methods suggests a move away from sex purely for procreation, it's likely that the impact wasn't widespread enough to cause a major societal shift in those times.
But it's possible that these practices planted the seeds for changes we see later, eventually leading to the sexual revolution of the 1960s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The availability of condoms, even primarily for men, hints at a growing recognition of sexuality as something beyond just reproduction. It's a subtle shift in perspective that's important to acknowledge.
It's fascinating to see how these early practices, as rudimentary as they might seem now, foreshadowed the future of reproductive health. Right. It's like a slow burn, a gradual shift in attitudes that eventually sparked a revolution.
And what's striking is that the pill's impact wasn't just about the technology itself.
Right.
It was about giving women control over their own bodies in a way they hadn't experienced before.
It's true. For the first time, women had a reliable, discreet, and relatively safe method of contraception they could manage themselves.
Yes.
This had a profound impact on society and culture.
Absolutely. A pivotal moment in the history of reproductive rights, and it wouldn't have been possible without the long and winding path that led up to it.
It's amazing to consider how this history, with its twists and turns, has brought us to where we are today.
It is.
But as we'll see in the final part of our deep dive, there's still much to be learned from those who came before us, both in terms of the challenges they faced and the ingenuity they displayed in their quest for reproductive control. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into contraception through the ages. We've explored some truly fascinating methods from the past, haven't we?
We have, from ancient herbs to animal gut condoms.
Right?
It's clear that the desire to, control fertility is a thread that runs throughout human history.
And we've seen how social attitudes and access and even, technological advancements have played a role in shaping the landscape of reproductive control.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up this journey through time, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Remember those animal gut condoms
Yeah.
and how effective they were?
Yes. Prepared to be even more surprised, you can still buy animal gut condoms today.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
Who's buying those in the 21st century?
Primarily people with latex allergies.
Oh, okay.
While they're not as widely available as, other types, they do exist.
Oh.
And the fact that they continue to be sold even after the invention of, rubber condoms speaks volumes about their efficacy.
That's incredible. So those early contraptions, as strange as they might seem to us now, actually laid the groundwork for modern contraceptive technology.
Absolutely. It highlights the ingenuity of people throughout history,
Yeah.
finding ways to meet their needs, even with limited resources and challenging circumstances.
It makes you wonder what other historical practices might surprise us
Right.
with their innovation or, shed light on evolving social norms. What seemingly outlandish practices from today might we find commonplace in the future?
That's the beauty of exploring history, isn't it? We uncover hidden connections.
We do.
We challenge our assumptions, and
Yeah.
we gain a deeper appreciation for the ingenuity and resourcefulness of those who came before us.
It's like looking through a window into the past
Yeah.
and seeing reflections of ourselves, our desires, and our challenges.
And that's what makes history so compelling. It's
Yeah.
not just about dates and events. It's
Yeah.
about understanding the human experience across time. We see how people grappled with similar questions and concerns,
Right.
and we gain insights into how we've arrived at where we are today.
So, as we conclude our deep dive into contraception through the ages, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What can we learn from this exploration?
The desire to control fertility is not new. It's a fundamental aspect of human experience that's been present throughout history, woven into our social, cultural, and technological evolution.
And progress isn't always, linear. There are setbacks, surprises, and often the most innovative solutions emerge from the most unexpected places.
Exactly.
It's a reminder to stay curious, open-minded when exploring the past.
Absolutely. Don't dismiss those seemingly strange or outdated practices from the past. There might be a hidden story there waiting to be uncovered, a story that connects us to those who came before us in ways we never imagined.
Perhaps those stories can even offer new perspectives or spark ideas that help us navigate the challenges of our own time. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the world of history. You never know what you might discover.
Well said.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you enjoyed this fascinating journey through the history of contraception. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most about what we uncovered? Share your reactions and any questions you have. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.